Tracy, tell us a bit
Hi.
about yourself and
Okay.
how have you got to where you are today?
Right. Well, I'm program lead for BA Primary Education with QTS at BGU, and prior to that, I've been a primary school teacher, an assistant head teacher, a Senko, a specialist dyslexia teacher, and amongst other roles in a primary school. So that sort of gives you background of my work history in education. And one of the responsibilities I had was specialist dyslexia teacher in the school for a period, which led me down an avenue of supporting children with dyslexia and understanding their needs. And then when I had the good fortune to come and work in higher education and teach about special educational needs, dyslexia has become an area that I've been lecturing in with the students. And it's become apparent that many students then come up to me to talk to me about their learning journey, and maybe it's led them to investigate their dyslexia or potential dyslexia. So I'm now also placement lead for our BA Primary Education programme. And of course, I'm encountering students who are making their way towards QTS, and sometimes they're having challenges. And sometimes that is because of an access need like dyslexia. So that's where I am at the moment in supporting all students, but I've got a particular interest now in dyslexia and how it impacts on trainee teachers. And that's where my research lies for my doctorate, is trying to work out what those characteristics are that are impacting on placements for the students.
Tell us a little bit more about the research that you are currently undertaking, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, of course. So the research is still in a developmental phase. I've done a few little pilots with some of our existing, well, our previous students, should I say, where I've been exploring with them a mixed methods approach to looking at and understanding what it's like for students with dyslexia. So, for example, I don't particularly want to explore the characteristics of dyslexia to try and unpick them, but I do want to understand which aspects of dyslexia impact on students. And I know that that is different for everybody. So I've gone down a mixed methods route, which sounds a bit strange when actually I want students' views of what it's been like on placement, because you would expect my research to be qualitative in nature. But actually, I'm using a tool called Q methodology, which allows the participants to explore their views about particular things. And in my case, that's characteristics of dyslexia, without having perhaps a bias or a predisposition of understanding about their needs. So the way that you gather your quantitative data is that you're forcing them to, I suppose, make a decision about whether something affects them or doesn't affect them. And then afterwards, we follow up with a discussion about, well, why did you feel that? And I'm hoping that the research brings out not just the negative aspects, perhaps, that dyslexia might present, but identify some of the real strengths that dyslexia brings to teaching or to them as teachers and their identity. So, yeah, it's in its early stages and it's still evolving. But the exciting thing is that I'm hoping that it will lead to stories of hope for people who are on a journey to becoming a teacher, I guess.
So that kind of brings me to, I suppose, the idea of, when somebody is struggling with a particular aspect of maybe their learning or their journey through to be trained as a teacher, in terms of the struggle that they have, isn't it subjective in the sense of how they see it, and when they highlight it in your research in terms of what they are struggling with, and for you to kind of then use it as in a quantitative approach, is it quite challenging to then sort of quantify it, I suppose, if you like, when it's something that could mean different things to different people, even if they highlight the same thing when it comes to like their response to what you're asking.
Yeah, that's one of the dilemmas of this research is I don't want to diminish the personal journey or even take away from the fact that it is very much, subjective, as you say. But the nature of Q methodology means that they can step away from that without realizing that they're expressing a view. It forces them to sounds awful using the word forces, doesn't it, when you talk about your participants, but it puts them in a position where they have to make a decision about, say, for example, a characteristic of dyslexia. We might ask them about, do you feel your dyslexia impacts on your ability to write newsletters to send home to parents, and in what way and to what extent? So yes, it is difficult to quantify, but on a personal level for students, they can express whether that is an element that impacts on them while they're training or at the end of their training.
Mm.
And then we can explore it with them as to why. And it might be that they've learned really good strategies, and if so, extracting that as a research outcome will be really empowering for somebody who's on the start of the journey as a teacher. That's my aspiration for it, that it will be, like I said, an avenue of hope really for anybody who's starting to get that imposter syndrome, and thinking maybe I shouldn't be a teacher because I have this access need, when actually their strengths will be the things that get them through, because I don't suppose we spend a lot of time looking at our personal attributes that are strengths. We tend to look at the teacher standards and how we're achieving those on placements. And actually what we need to look at is what strategies and skills students have that they bring to the role that will further enhance their experience and help them to overcome barriers that they face because of the dyslexia that they, have recognised.
So what do you foresee as like opportunities or possible opportunities, when you say they might have something that they can bring to the role because of their dyslexia? What kind of skills or whatever that are you talking about?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to put I suppose I'm putting a theory forward now, aren't I? But it might be that students see themselves as role models for other students, and children in the classroom, so that they can make a decision about whether they disclose their dyslexia. That's often a dilemma that students face when they're either going on placement, applying for jobs, to declare or not to declare. That's often a conversation I have with students. So if I would hope that if they have an opportunity to explore their characteristics, that might help them to make a decision about that, and whether they see it as a disability or an empowering, enabling thing. So, as I said, it might be a modelling, a role model sort of characteristic, but it might be in that, there are some I don't know, characteristics that people associate with dyslexia frequently, and that's a talent in another area, whether it's, they may struggle with some literacy aspects, whatever that may be, but they may also then have strengths in oracy or articulating, or, it might be in terms of creativity or in terms of seeing the bigger picture and being holistic about something. So I think those are all valuable attributes that students need to recognise in themselves, because it's not just about the written word when we're in the classroom. It's that whole teacher persona and the things we bring to the role so that we become individuals and we can build on our identity.
Okay, so one of the things that kind of intrigues me the most, I suppose, is like the value of labeling. So,
Yeah.
you know, again, I quite like to hear your views on
Mm.
what you think to the potential impact, I suppose, and also like, you know, how useful it is to actually have this labeling of somebody being dyslexic and having particular characteristics that they have to pay attention to, or, you know, kind of having to, I suppose, look for these characteristics if you were somebody who was diagnosed later on in life, where you almost have to kind of find your way back to, you know, where did it all start, and all that kind of you know, sort of way of thinking about it. So I just wonder what your views are regarding that, because it relates to the concept of inclusion. I suppose like it's something that I want to get into, you know, later on in this chat. But yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so big question, big debate actually in education, you know, the value of labels. And I, I guess I probably sit on the fence on that, because they can be helpful, but they can also be a hindrance. And I guess it depends on your philosophy about inclusion, isn't it, as a teacher. And as trainee teachers, we're always encouraging them to consider and reflect on what their views are and what drives them as a teacher. So I guess for me, a label is just a way of having a collective understanding when it comes to talking about a feature or a characteristic or a sort of diagnosis, if you like, you know. And it's tough because dyslexia is so neurodiverse that, you know, no two people or no two children with dyslexia would ever manifest itself in the same way. It's so complex. And so I think that in one respect, the label can be very limiting. And for some people, it can be almost like lead down an avenue of sticking plaster approach to view the dyslexia, or support people to overcome the barriers. But in another respect, it can just be a common word that we use because it's such a complex phenomenon to discuss, isn't it? You know, so it has that label. I guess in terms of using the label as well, for some people it can bring them comfort because they have an understanding then of why they are like they are, or why they've been on the journey that they've been on. So for some of our trainees, and it's interesting that you speak about people who become knowledgeable about their diagnosis later in life, and that frequently happens in higher education because the structure of teaching is such that, especially in the early years, the way that we teach reading, writing and literacy and other elements of the curriculum really has become quite inclusive, to the point that it doesn't manifest itself until you're working at a higher level of education and it challenges you in a new way, because you're not as scaffolded, or there's a greater emphasis on reading or writing or, you know, processing, whatever that is. And so for our students, often they come to university having been successful in school, maybe struggled, but been successful and pleased with themselves. And then suddenly they find themselves in an academic environment that really challenges them to the point where they think they can't do it. And that is a concern. And I know, you know, not too far back in our history, there's evidence that universities actively, and especially teacher training colleges at the time, actively made sure they didn't recruit anybody with a diagnosis with a dyslexia into teaching, which is horrendous now to think of that, you know. And how many people have come through that system and not declared their dyslexia because they wanted to achieve their dream. And it'd just give the Disability Act a field day, wouldn't it, nowadays, if we actually unpicked that basket. But, you know, many students do find out later on, and sometimes it's comforting to have a name for the thing that they're struggling with. But then for others, it's irrelevant, you know. It's not an excuse or a reason. It's just just another part of me. I'm a person with dyslexia, as I'm a person with glasses, or I'm a person with this particular strength. You know, I can sing, you can't. It's that sort of view, isn't it? And I guess that contributes to the whole debate when we go out on placement. Do we tell the schools? Are the schools going to be sympathetic? And it's interesting, in the small pilots that I've done, students have various views about disclosing, but I get the feeling that in primary, not everybody, but some experience have been that the teachers in the classrooms are very inclusive with their children, but then when it comes to their trainee teachers, it's almost as if dyslexia is for children, not for adults, you know. And you think how far we've come on this journey of inclusion to then suddenly meet new barriers at a different level. And you know, we don't grow out of dyslexia, so why on earth would we feel that those trainee teachers wouldn't need support?
Yeah, because I suppose like the one thing that a lot of people probably are thinking about is that, you know, if you can get to the same destination, and obviously everybody has their own unique journey to get to, you know, whatever destination that they're aiming for. You know, if someone was to be a little bit provocative, they'd probably be like, well, what does it matter? You know,
Yeah.
why, you know, how you got there, you know, is for you to kind of experience. And, you know, providing that it's not going to stop you from getting there completely, does it matter, you know, with this diagnosis thing, you know, where I can just be myself, and then yeah, maybe I would have to kind of use a different strategy. I would have to try harder in particular aspects. But as you mentioned earlier, that you see dyslexia as something that can bring you both, you know, opportunities and limitations. And so then is it not then a bit pointless to talk about, you know, the, you know, this kind of way of seeing something that is potentially to be so diverse that, you know, it's almost like it's impossible to pinpoint something that you can really make use of. Then again, like, to be controversial, what's the point?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I suppose that all links with that debate, as you said, around inclusion, isn't it? If we're truly inclusive, then it wouldn't matter, because we were just accepting and celebrating the diversity that we encounter within ourselves and within people that we interact with. Um, but I guess there's still some politics behind it in terms of support mechanisms and funding, and you know, some people who can embrace their difference, whereas other people are still coming to terms with it. So it becomes a whole, I suppose, I can't think of an analogy, but it's almost like a storm, isn't it? A beautiful storm that for some people, being on that roller coaster of a storm, enjoy it and embrace it and go with it. And then for some of us, it's really we're holding on tight and just clinging on for dear life, thinking, will I get through this? Will I achieve what I want to do? And I suppose that analogy fits very nicely with my journey with my doctorate around this, because I sort of, I have moments of clarity, you know. I think I know what I'm doing, and especially when I'm talking like this, it helps me to sort of be able to articulate in my head what it is I'm doing and rationalize it. But then when I'm on my own, I start to doubt what I'm doing and I start unpicking it. And I guess that's the same for somebody who's on that journey of discovery about themselves as a dyslexic teacher. You know, it's I know I want to do this and I'm getting there, but we've been so indoctrinated in education from being very small, haven't we, into getting things right, whatever that right is. And often we're scaffolded as young people to do it right. And I see it very often with our trainees when they start, that they're a bit reticent about expressing a view because they're worried they won't get it right. And actually, what we're doing is deconstructing learning when they come to university and saying, okay, you say what you like, just talk and tell me and explore and debate and, you know, critique and analyze. and those skills almost seem to be sort of hidden within them because they're so focused on getting to that goal instead of exploring themselves and their way of learning and their skills, as you said, their limitations and those sorts of things that would actually be really rich data to know. Even though the endpoint is important, that journey is equally as important to understanding yourself so you can replicate it, or whether you can perhaps avoid the pitfalls next time, whatever that is. And I think that yeah, what is the point if we're fully inclusive? But unfortunately, I don't think as a society we aren't there with inclusion. And there are lots of theories around inclusion out there, and you read about, you know, what is this thing called inclusion, and I'm sure they would all agree on one thing, is that we're not fully there. And will we ever be in my lifetime? I don't know, but I hope to keep pushing and hoping that we can achieve something along that lines, you know, the holy grail, if you like.
Okay, so that's really interesting, because that's exactly what kind of what I wanted to ask you, in terms of what is that holy grail when it comes to inclusion? What is inclusion to you? And I suppose if I was to be a bit more specific, you know, there are certain words that are usually used, you know, in conjunction of inclusion, things like equality, equity, that kind of thing. So what do you see as inclusion, and what is being inclusive all about?
Yeah. Oh gosh, how long have you got? Goodness sake. So I guess for me, inclusion is where it almost sounds like I'm going against what I'm doing with my research, but suddenly those differences don't matter, and that actually you are so broad in your acceptance of difference or diversity or whatever it is characteristic that you display, that it becomes the norm to flex and be fluid in the way that you get to whatever it is you're trying to achieve, whether it's a target or a process or a skill development, whatever that is. For me, it would be that everybody is on board with that. So there's no discomfort, you know, that things aren't happening along a particular trajectory. I'm not sure we'll ever get there in education, because the way that we measure things almost makes us conform to a particular route, doesn't it? But when it comes to being a fully inclusive society, a fully inclusive classroom, you would not, yes, you would notice diversity, but you wouldn't pick it out as being inequitable or, you know, sort of isolating or segregative or anything like that. It would be just a very, I don't know, like a well choreographed dance, I would say. You know, it happens, it works, and everybody is getting from it what they need and achieving their potential. Because I think ultimately, when we're not inclusive, potential is capped, learning is capped, process is capped, so that, you know, there is inequality.
So I suppose this is where it gets interesting, because if we're talking about this idea of inclusive or inclusion being what you've just described, by talking about equality and equity, and we're perpetuating the non-inclusiveness of what we're looking at. Because if you're always going to be looking at things through the lens of are things, you know, equal, and are they equitable, aren't you looking out for things that are different, and therefore amplifying those features that could otherwise actually be quite, you know, maybe normal for some people, to kind of not having to really think twice about it. I suppose it's a little bit like, you know, one of those like equality section in a job, you know, application form. It's like, by ticking that box, and you then being told to recognize the difference, and it's supposed to matter somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think you're right, because, you know, the processes and systems and society is set up to focus in on those differences, whether it's to positively discriminate or to ensure that we're not discriminating, whatever that is. And the whole system is built on inequity and measure, isn't it? And that quantitative thing. Whereas I guess my holy grail of inclusion is more qualitative and not measurable, because it's a fluid thing, isn't it? It's all relative to the context and the people or the situations that you're in, because inequality can occur at any point relative to the context you're in, you know, whether it is any of those 9 protected characteristics that we read about in the Equality Act of 2010. If that is not represented, you then get into that debate of, do we need to have that represented? Whereas in inclusion, no, we don't, because we're not judging anybody by that characteristic. We're judging by the thing that we're involved in, whether it's teaching, whether it's cooking, whether it's, you know, washing up. We're taking away those characteristics, and so we're just seeing the action that we're involved in. And as long as we've all got equal access to engage with that activity, the way we do it doesn't matter. As you said, you know, the journey to the end point is part of the beauty of doing the task, if you like. It's very philosophical, isn't it, really, in terms of achievability. But if we all aspire to that, then we hope that, you know, we don't want to lose our own identity, because that comes with it as well, doesn't it? There's the sort of, well, this is who I am. And some people, we go back to that notion of labels, it's important to them because it is part of the way that they identify themselves with the rest of the community that they contribute to. So you don't want to take that away, because then you would say in that actually is, you know, taking away their options or their rights, you know. It's very, very messy.
Because I suppose, like, the other question, you know, in terms of what you've just said, is that if the kind of holy grail is more about the qualitative aspect, you know, of this particular phenomenon that we're looking at, then how do we justify the use of, you know, this mixed methods approach of bringing in the quantitative elements, because, you know, if this is not what you're aiming for ultimately, then why are we bringing that in?
Yeah, good question, and one that I tussle with regularly as I'm making my way through the fog of research. And I think that the way that I am rationalizing or defending my decision at the moment is that I need a tool that will allow me and my participants to identify on an even playing field what matters to them that they might not have realized mattered while they were on placement. Because yes, their journey as a trainee teacher to achieving that is very qualitative, and they will be emotive when they talk to me about that journey, especially if it was not as positive as they would have hoped training to be a teacher. So I'm not diminishing that at all, and that is really important element of their journey to become a teacher. But I want to try and spotlight or isolate, look at this label of dyslexia that we discussed earlier and say, okay, we recognize that these are some tasks that teachers and trainee teachers do. How did you find them? And how did you find them in relation to your dyslexia? You know, was it a positive or a negative experience? And so the quantitative method part of it, if you like, the Q method, allows the researcher and the participant to explore a phenomenon or a range of criteria that is done as objectively as it can be about a subjective thing, so that actually when we sit back and look at what they've produced in a quantitative way, we can then explore it together. So it's almost like co-researching them, because the benefits would be, one would hope, that they understand themselves a little better, maybe even recognize some of the strengths that they have that they hadn't celebrated before. So, you know, that's my rationale at the moment for it, and it may change again as it does when you're conducting research, but that's my vision, I guess, as to why I wanted to bring that element into it.
So based on that conceptualization of your holy grail, you know, regarding inclusion, I suppose it's linked to what you've just said, but if I was to ask you the question, how can you make your research inclusive based on that particular perception or idea of what inclusion looks like, then what would your response be?
It's interesting because over the period of time that I've been working and working on my proposal, I really had this strong sort of feeling of wanting to be inclusive as I possibly could. And so with my specialist dyslexia teacher knowledge, I'd sort of got this view that when I conduct my research, I want to make sure that I remove any possible ethical issues for my participants, not giving them, you know, things to do that would involve lots of reading, which is why the Q methodology seemed to work, because it's just a set of cards with limited words on it. It can be presented dyslexia friendly way, you know, and I got really excited about it and went off and did this pilot. And then conducted interviews, which was verbal, and made sure that I asked the participants, were they still comfortable with the methods? Would they, you know, was there something that I could do to make sure that I was being as inclusive as possible? And then after I'd conducted this two-step process of Q method and then interview, I then found myself writing an email to send them a transcript of their interview. And at that horrific moment of pressing send, I suddenly realized I was sending them an hour or an hour and a half's worth of transcript in type for them to read, to then tell me, yes, that was a true reflection of my interview with you. And I just suddenly thought, you know, that inherent, or so I thought, inherent view on inclusion and my inclusive practice and how brilliant I was at it suddenly was blown out of the water, because I totally then had got a 14 page document to send them to read, which, you know, was totally in contrast to what I was trying to achieve in my research. And needless to say, I didn't get a response from my participant because I'd overwhelmed them by sending them that transcript. So that's still a journey, if I'm honest, I'm on. And part of my pilot has been to explore with my participants what would make this more accessible to you, so that I can be as inclusive as I can be without second guessing, because there's always assumptions about your participants, isn't there? That means you're introducing potential bias to your research. So I'm still tussling with that, if I'm honest. About how I make sure that I'm inclusive, not just in the process, but ethically either side at all points during my research. And it feels like I'm in a little bit of a rabbit hole, if I'm honest, at the moment with it. But I'm embracing it and seeing what comes out of those conversations with people who are interested in being part of research, you know, to try and devise a way of overcoming those barriers that I'm facing.
Because I think that's the interesting part, because like when you talked about, you know, what the holy grail is when it comes to being inclusive, you mentioned, you know, the idea of it, like, you know, like if it doesn't matter anymore, like, you know, it's not being thought about as some kind of like extra thing that you have to do to highlight, you know, this thing that exists to make you different and that kind of thing. I guess, you know, my query in terms of that kind of making things more accessible in that sense, wouldn't that then again be one of those things that highlights that you are different, and I recognize that you're different, so I'm going to treat you differently by giving you something that I would have otherwise, you know, given you something different.
Absolutely.
So it's like, how do you like, where do you draw the line? I think is what I'm interested in terms of like making them feel that, you know, you're not treating them differently and having the fact that there's this dyslexic, like basically, in your mind, every step you take in terms of every decision you make, at the same time, kind of helping them to be able to kind of, approach whatever it is that you want them to approach in a way that they don't feel disadvantaged. Where do you draw that line?
I know. And actually, do you draw a line? Because to me, this is about control and that sort of researcher participant dilemma, isn't it? And it's the same with teacher and student, or teacher and pupil, or teacher and child. Who's in control about the decision making? And I guess, if we said there isn't a line, is it more about who's in control about the decisions we make and that process that we undertake to get ultimately back to the goal that you talked about at the beginning? Because the journey could be a windy one, it could be a direct one, it could be one via car, it could be one via, a speech to text synthesizer, whatever. The actual mode of journey shouldn't be relevant, and you would hope that if anything was possible and you had a magic wand with inclusion, whoever needs that I don't know, adaptation, access need, it would just be available. So it has implications funding wise, in the whole scheme of the world and society. But if equal opportunities is there, then also the resources are there to fulfill that, aren't they? And I think that's where this whole complexity is not just about inclusion, it's about the politics, the funding, the attitudes of the people that are involved in the process, that all contribute to an inclusive or not inclusive environment, I guess. Because, ideally in my research, it will be a case of, I want to know this. How can you help me to find that out with you? And it's almost like giving control to the participant to tell me what would make that accessible for them, because then, it's like me turning up and I've got my glasses on, or, whatever it is I need. I've taken that choice to do that. It's not been enforced on me, and it's not been, I've not done it because you need me to wear these. I do it because I've chosen to, Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because I was thinking like, if things were very scaffolded, as we mentioned earlier, then you're almost kind of like depriving someone to have the opportunity to actually give it a go, or like, to have that journey, to be able to work out something, even if it was potentially, harder than maybe someone else, to go through a similar journey. And so having perhaps like this, the tools that are available for them to pick from themselves, like for example, like maybe we can use the example of you sending the transcript as an example. If there were some kind of like suggestions which kind of tell them that if you struggle to read the transcript, you could always kind of use the the text to speech function of the PDF thing that you can use. Then it's up to that person to decide whether or not this is something that they that they can use to help themselves. Then I think like then that kind of gives them that agency or ownership of
absolutely
deciding what's best for them. And I think it perhaps that could be maybe more like the inclusive sort of holy grail that you were talking about, because then it's not about what we impose on people of like, this is what you should do, but this is what you can do, but it's up to you whether or not you do it. That kind of thing.
I think that's so true, and that resonates with just a very little phrase I used to use a lot when I was in school with colleagues. And it's about enabling, not disabling, isn't it? And I think that in life we make choices. It's a natural thing to do. So with children, instead of just telling them how they're going to access their learning, we should be giving them a rich, I suppose, rounded experience of, these are the potential things that you might like to explore to help you with your learning, and not limit it to those children who've got a label or a diagnosis, but anybody, you know, it's almost like there's the box and there's some things, and if you need them, use them, and if you don't, you won't, you know. And that's always been my philosophy with teaching. And sometimes I'd have, you know, teachers say, well, they don't have any needs, so why should they use A, B, or C to support them? And I say, well, does anyone stop you as an adult from using a calculator or an audio book, or, you know, or a coloured overlay, or, you know, your glasses when you work? No. So that's a life skill. So we're in the business of educating, yes, but we're also in the business of educating people to their choices when they become lifelong learners, you know, so that they can explore all the different potential tools that are available to them. And nowadays with IT and AI and all that sort of thing, it is such a rich resource to draw from. Whereas, you know, if I thought back to when I was at school, it was very, very limited. So having that exciting culture and open-mindedness in education is so important, I think, to give that control to people so they can take ownership, as you said.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges that you face when it comes to researching with dyslexic teachers rather than dyslexic children?
I guess for adults, it's some of it might be about their own emotional journey that's linked to it, because everybody has had a different experience, and there's research I've been reading about people who feel empowered by it and celebrate what they've done, and almost as if, you know, wearing it as a badge of honor to say, I've got this label, but look how well I've done, which is great for them. But there are others who actually perhaps don't feel that things have been a struggle the whole time. And I think, how do I reconcile with that? How do I manage the emotion that's also attached when I'm trying to look, for want of a better phrase, clinically at dyslexia in teachers rather than, you know, look at that emotional journey? So I think that's going to be a challenge, because I don't want my participants to feel that I'm belittling or even ignoring that. And it is really important their narrative is part of how they've engaged or disengaged, or, you know, whatever has happened, it all contributes. It's been influential, hasn't it, in their journey? But I want to try and be able to put that to one side, give them time for that. But my research is about the characteristics and how can we identify those things that might be challenging for trainee teachers, or might be a real opportunity for trainee teachers, so that the next generation, the next cohort that comes through, it's teachers empowering teachers, you know, and sharing what their experience is, so we can all feel we're learning something from each other, so that I can improve the program that I work on, and the students who are on the program have somewhere to go when they're starting to explore their diagnosis for the first time, I guess.
What's your view on disclosing or not?
That's such a leading question. I personally think it's important to share if you feel comfortable. And I often have this conversation with my students, and I will say to them, ultimately, it's your decision and I will support you on that. But sometimes you almost need to test the context or the setting before you make a decision. And some students prefer to be seen for them. And I suppose it's that debate about, am I Tracey with dyslexia, or am I dyslexic Tracey? You know, it's that sort of subtlety, isn't it, around language? And it's the same when students go into school for the first time. It's like, am I going to wait and see what this school is like, what their inclusive practice is like, before I make a decision about whether I disclose or not? And then I'll say to them, well, then, if that's going to sway your decision, is it best not to? You know, because if they are inclusive, do you need to? And we go back round in that little, I don't know, vortex of do we, don't we, you know, because you could argue both ways. And I think it's down to the individual, how they view their dyslexia, whether they feel they want somebody to know so they give understanding, whether they want people to know so they understand why they do what they do, or whether actually they think, do you know what, I want you to see me for me, and the dyslexia is just something that's none of your business, actually, because I manage it very, very well. I think it's great that students will come and talk to me about it, and I really embrace that, because I feel honoured that they feel they can have that internal tussle with me as somebody on the outside to help them make a decision. But no, I suppose if I'm truly inclusive, it wouldn't matter. It really doesn't matter.
Okay, so now moving on from your research, I suppose, like, because of you being a specialist, you know, in this area, and your, you know, obviously your knowledge and understanding is really valuable to those people who might be listening to this. What would your tips be for supporting dyslexic learners?
Okay, I think first and foremost is conversations. Okay, seeing that individual as an individual and not falling into that trap of seeing dyslexia and thinking, I know what dyslexia is, because it's like trying to get hold of a jellyfish. You just can't, because it's unique to the person, you know, a bit like we're all unique learners, aren't we? And we all find our way, and our brains develop differently. So this neurodiverse presentation that we have as an educationalist, we need to practice it in the classroom with young people, teachers, students, whoever. So for me, it's about being open-minded to exploring it and being on the journey with that person if they choose to disclose with you, and asking, what do you want me to do? Is there something that you need, or are you rather happy to go it alone? You know, please let me know. And if you need something from me, then ask me. Because, you know, having taught children with dyslexia, when they're young, if they're not given a voice, how will they ever know what they want? How will they ever voice it as an adult later in life and make decisions about what works for them if they're not empowered and given a voice early? So I think that that voice is at the root of it, you know, in terms of supporting, being there in the sidelines, if you like, if somebody needs it, but not, you know, unless they ask for it, taking the lead in that situation, because it's such a unique thing. You know, you can empathize, but you can't actually wear their shoes and walk their journey.
So in terms of like the more practical side of things, let's say if I was struggling with my reading, you know, and I'm a dyslexic learner, and I'd like you to advise me on how I would be able to try out some of the strategies that might help me. What would those things be?
Okay, so I guess part of the conversation would be to determine what elements of reading that that individual is struggling with. Is it actually decoding? Is it actually you know, interpretation, processing? And then from there we can start to either help people to break down reading. So if it's actually sustaining reading, especially at higher education level, and you're trying to, I don't know, make your way through some big piece of research paper, or you're marking a text for somebody. I know my first master's that I marked, I just looked and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, I'm so excited about doing this, but I can't, I just don't know where to start. So, you know, strategies that I use are things like getting paper copies and then chunking it into smaller bits. Colour, you know, works very much for me. In fact, I'm working on a document at the minute and it looks like a rainbow, and I must remember to remove the colours before I submit it. But making sections out of it that are manageable for you are really paramount when it comes to reading, I guess. So, you know, highlighting, underlining, all things that we tell children to do, but actually we naturally do it without even seeing it as a strategy. When I'm working with texts like journal articles, I'm also a bit like a reading butterfly. You know, I will go to the bits that either look neat and tidy and I can focus on, or I go to the bits that I know don't take a lot of interpreting, like literature. You know, the lit review, sometimes I just think, wow, that's far too much for me to delve into. There's lots of citations in there that make it difficult for me to read. So I almost feel like the flow and the fluency of reading is a challenge. So I say to people, what bit instinctively is your eye drawn to? Why are you looking at that? Right, okay, so can we interpret that? And maybe not chop the book up or the article, but if you're using photocopies or on screen, you can then break those down into subsections and save them in different documents so that you only look at one little bit. Because I think for people, if they're struggling with reading, sometimes it's overwhelmed with, you know that old what is it, saying about you can't eat the elephant all in one go, but if you break it up into little bits, you'll get there. And it's the same with reading, isn't it? Especially at higher education level. So these would be the sort of strategies I would say. Explore them. If they don't work for you, maybe it is putting a coloured overlay on screen. One thing I use is audio. You know, I listen to books more and I can stop and re-listen them. And yet when I talk to colleagues, that it just does not work for them at all. They can't focus on it. But for me, hearing the book as well as having it in front of me is really powerful. So it you know, we can suggest strategies. There are loads out there. You know, they work for some, they work not for others, but it's about that conversation and trying to deconstruct what the challenges are. Then we can start to even explore or even invent a strategy that might work.
Okay, thank you very much. And so thinking back to your holy grail, you know, your vision of inclusion, you know,
Yeah.
maybe regarding dyslexia, what would you like to see in 10 years' time?
In school, in higher education, in teaching?
In general. So like,
Okay.
what was your
Yeah.
vision for, you know, like in 10 years' time, what would be good progress?
Okay. I think that I suppose controversially that dyslexia wouldn't be a thing, if you like. It would just be I don't know, for want of a better word, a characteristic that some of us have, like, you know, like I said, like we have glasses, we have coloured hair, we have different race, faith, etc. It's not seen as worrying, upsetting. I think of my history in the classroom and parents who worried immensely about their children's future because they had dyslexia. And I guess it links back to that equal opportunities, isn't it? Doesn't matter. You can do what you want to do and you can be who you want to be if you've got the right environment and you've got aspiration and you've got the right attitudes, and it's not seen as a barrier, that actually it's just seen as a characteristic. I think that would be where I would hope in 10 years' time, that people have understanding without jumping to a conclusion about, oh, right, you're dyslexic, so you won't be able to spell, which is so far from the truth. So many dyslexics are amazing spellers, you know, or amazing readers, but they might just have difficulties with processing or organization and time management. It's such a multifaceted phenomenon that actually you can't I don't know, put it in a little box and say this is dyslexia. I would like to think that people have a greater understanding of that and celebrate the the beauty of it, I guess, which is really rich, you know, that it brings.
So finally, if anybody's interested in this particular area, what would you recommend that they check out?
Okay, so I would recommend that they check out so articles by Jonathan Glazard, who is a colleague at he was at Leeds Beckett, and now you've put me on the spot. I can't remember where he's moved to. I think it might be Edge Hill. He's done lots of work on trainee teachers and dyslexia, particularly in the field of postgraduate trainee teachers and their experiences. And he talks a lot about that qualitative, like emotional journey, the narrative, the stories of teachers, you know, trainee teachers. And it will be really exciting, actually, in years to come, to do some research on existing teachers and how they made it in their journey because they didn't declare, or it, you know, wasn't widely known at the time. But yeah, Jonathan Glazard, I would advocate articles by him at the moment.
Brilliant. Well, really looking forward to hearing more about your research
Thank you.
in the coming months, so that we can see like how it's all kind of going, and just to see like basically what you find out from your journey to get towards that holy grail that you mentioned. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you about this. And so any last words you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I don't know, just, you know, if you're in a fog with your own research or you're concerned about dyslexia, just reach out to somebody, find somebody you trust and start talking, because that's what's helping me with my research, is talking about it, because you don't know what you know until you start articulating it, do you?
That's great. Thank you, Tracey.
Thanks.